The steam whistle cut through the Montana dawn like a blade through silk, announcing the arrival of the eastbound train to Copper Creek. But what stepped off that platform wasn't just another passenger seeking passage west. It was a woman whose torn wedding dress told a story of shattered dreams, whose bleeding hands spoke of desperate escape, and whose terrified eyes held secrets that would change one lonely rancher's life forever. What happened next would test the boundaries of compassion, challenge an entire town's prejudices, and prove that sometimes the most broken souls carry the greatest capacity for love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jim Harper had grown accustomed to the rhythm of solitude. 3 years had passed since Anna's fever took her during that brutal winter, and the Broken Arrow Ranch had settled into the quiet cadence of a man learning to live with ghosts. The morning sun painted the Montana horizon in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows across the pasture where his cattle grazed with lazy contentment. At 34, Jim possessed the weathered hands of a man who understood that the land demanded respect, not conquest, and his blue eyes held the steady calm that came from accepting life's harder truths. The ranch house stood like a faithful sentinel against the vast expanse of rolling hills, its white clapboard siding bearing the gentle scars of prairie storms and scorching summers. Anna's flower boxes still hung beneath the kitchen windows, though Jim had long since stopped tending the geraniums she'd loved so dearly. The red barn housed 12 horses and served as shelter for the equipment that kept the ranch running, while the chicken coop provided eggs that Jim often forgot to collect until the hens' complaints grew too insistent to ignore. Each morning began the same way. Coffee brewed strong and black, biscuits from a recipe he'd memorized but never perfected, and the methodical checking of fences that seemed to require constant attention. Jim's border collie, Rex, followed him through these rituals with the patient understanding of a creature who knew his master's moods better than most humans ever had. The dog's presence provided comfort without demanding conversation, which suited Jim perfectly during these years of voluntary exile from the complexities of society. Copper Creek lay 5 miles east, connected to the ranch by a dirt road that turned to mud during spring thaws and dust during summer droughts. The town served as a supply stop for ranchers and a brief respite for travelers heading further west. But Jim ventured there only when necessity demanded supplies or business required his attention. The townspeople treated him with respectful distance, understanding that grief had carved out a hollow space in his life that small talk couldn't fill. Today felt different, though Jim couldn't identify why. The air carried an unusual weight, like the pressure that preceded thunderstorms, yet the sky stretched clear and endless above the mountains. His cattle seemed restless, shifting and lowing, with an energy that spoke of coming change. Even Rex appeared more alert than usual, his ears pricked toward sounds that remained beyond human hearing. Jim completed his morning chores with mechanical precision, repairing a loose board on the corral fence and checking the water levels in the troughs. The mundane tasks provided anchor points in a life that had learned to flow around the absence of shared purpose. Anna had brought music to these same activities, humming folk songs while she fed the chickens, or calling out observations about the weather that turned simple work into conversation. Now the silence stretched unbroken, except for the whisper of wind through prairie grass and the distant sound of cattle moving across the range. The decision to ride into town hadn't been planned. Jim simply found himself saddling his bay mare, Clementine, with the vague intention of checking on supplies at Mary Chun's general store. The ride took an hour at an easy pace, following the rutted road that curved around hillocks covered in buffalo grass and wild lupin. Copper Creek announced itself gradually, first through the sight of scattered homesteads, then the water tower that served the railway, and finally the cluster of wooden buildings that comprised the town's modest business district. The train station occupied a position of prominence on Main Street, its platform extending like a wooden tongue toward the iron rails that connected this remote corner of Montana to the wider world. Twice weekly, the locomotive arrived with mail, supplies, and the occasional passenger seeking opportunity in the territories. Most travelers continued west toward mining claims or lumber camps, but some remained to try their luck at farming or establishing businesses that served the growing population of settlers. Jim had no particular interest in the train's arrival, but the sound of the whistle drew his attention as he tied Clementine to the hitching post outside Sheen's store. The locomotive appeared as a dark smudge against the horizon, trailing a plume of black smoke that stained the morning sky. Its approach created a minor stir among the townspeople, who gathered on the platform with the casual curiosity of those for whom any diversion from routine held appeal. Mary Chun emerged from her store, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, while scanning the platform for familiar faces. A heavy-set woman with graying hair pulled into a practical bun. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of town gossip and the supernatural ability to extract personal information from even the most reticent customers. Her presence guaranteed that any interesting arrivals would be thoroughly cataloged and discussed throughout the community before the day ended. The train's brakes released steam with a dramatic hiss as the locomotive ground to a halt beside the platform. The conductor, a thin man named Peterson who'd worked this route for over a decade, stepped down to oversee the unloading of mailbags and cargo. 3 passengers disembarked: a traveling salesman with a sample case, an elderly woman visiting relatives, and a figure that caused every conversation on the platform to die into stunned silence. She appeared like something from a fever dream, a vision so unexpected and tragic that several onlookers instinctively stepped backward. Her wedding dress, once pristine white silk, now bore the stains of travel and the tears of desperate flight. The elaborate bustle had collapsed on one side, and the train of delicate lace dragged in the dust like a wounded wing. Blood spotted the fabric where thorns or rough handling had found their mark, and her dark hair had escaped its careful arrangement to hang in tangled waves around shoulders that shook with exhaustion. But it was her face that held the crowd, transfixed. Beautiful despite the fear etched into every feature, she possessed the kind of refined prettiness that spoke of privilege and careful upbringing. Her brown eyes darted frantically across the assembled faces, searching for threats that might have followed her onto this remote platform. She clutched a small carpet bag with hands that trembled visibly, and when she attempted to step down from the train car, her legs buckled beneath her weight. The fall wasn't dramatic, more of a controlled collapse that spoke of someone who had reached the absolute limit of physical and emotional endurance. She landed hard on her right side, crying out as her ankle twisted beneath the weight of her body and the cumbersome dress. The carpet bag spilled open, revealing a few hastily packed belongings and what appeared to be important papers that now scattered across the dusty platform like autumn leaves. For a moment, nobody moved. The scene was so unexpected, so far removed from the ordinary rhythm of small-town life that shock paralyzed even the most naturally helpful residents. The woman struggled to gather her scattered possessions while fighting back tears of pain and humiliation, her wedding dress spreading around her like the petals of a crushed flower. Jim found himself moving before conscious thought could intervene. His boots struck the wooden platform with deliberate steps as he approached the fallen woman, Rex trotting at his heels with alert concern. The crowd parted automatically, recognizing something in Jim's purposeful movement that suggested he'd assumed responsibility for the situation. He knelt beside her with the careful grace of someone accustomed to dealing with injured animals, his voice pitched low and steady to avoid causing additional alarm. "Ma'am, you're hurt. Let me help you." His words carried no demand or expectation, simply an offer extended without condition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She looked up at him with eyes that held the wild wariness of a creature that had learned to expect cruelty from strangers. For a heartbeat, Jim thought she might refuse his assistance or even flee back onto the train. Instead, something in his manner seemed to penetrate her fear, and she nodded almost imperceptibly while attempting to gather her torn skirts with shaking hands. Jim helped her to a sitting position with gentle efficiency, noting the way she favored her right ankle and the exhaustion that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her skin felt fevered beneath his touch, and he suspected she hadn't eaten properly in days. The wedding dress, expensive despite its current condition, suggested wealth and status that made her presence in this remote location even more mysterious. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked, maintaining the same calm tone while efficiently collecting her scattered belongings. The papers appeared to be legal documents of some kind, though he avoided reading them out of respect for her privacy. "Catherine," she whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again with more strength. "Catherine Sullivan, Kate." The name seemed to require effort, as though she wasn't entirely certain of her own identity. Jim nodded and continued gathering her possessions, noting the quality of the few items she'd managed to pack. A silver brush and mirror set, a small Bible with a leather cover worn smooth by handling, and several pieces of jewelry that suggested significant value. Whatever had driven her to flee had happened quickly, allowing time for only the most essential items. "I'm Jim Harper," he said simply. "I have a ranch about 5 miles from here. Dr. Whitman should take a look at that ankle, and you need food. And rest." He spoke matter-of-factly, as though helping desperate strangers in wedding dresses was a regular occurrence rather than the most unusual event Copper Creek had witnessed in years. Kate's eyes filled with tears at this unexpected kindness, and she struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude. "I don't have money for a doctor," she admitted, the confession clearly causing her additional distress. "I had to leave everything behind." The statement hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, confirming everyone's suspicions that her story involved more than simple misfortune. Mary Chun moved closer with obvious curiosity, while several other townspeople exchanged meaningful glances that suggested the local gossip network had already begun cataloging every detail for later analysis. Jim ignored the gathering crowd and focused entirely on Kate's immediate needs. "We'll worry about payment later," he said, slipping his arm around her waist to help her stand. "Right now, let's get you to the doctor." The simple act of rising to her feet proved more challenging than expected. Kate's injured ankle couldn't bear her full weight, and the elaborate wedding dress hampered her movement at every turn. Jim solved the problem by lifting her easily in his arms, treating her as carefully as he would handle a newborn calf or injured horse. His strength was evident, but never threatening, and Kate found herself relaxing against his chest despite every survival instinct that screamed warnings about trusting strangers. The crowd followed at a respectful distance as Jim carried Kate toward Dr. Whitman's office, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of speculation that would fuel dinner table discussions throughout Copper Creek for weeks to come. A woman in a torn wedding dress, appearing from nowhere with obvious signs of desperate flight, being rescued by the town's most reclusive rancher. It was the kind of story that transformed ordinary communities into centers of dramatic intrigue. Dr. Eleanor Whitman possessed the practical competence that frontier life demanded of its medical professionals. A woman in her 50s who'd arrived in Copper Creek 15 years earlier with medical training from a Boston hospital and the determination to serve communities that attracted few qualified physicians. She'd earned universal respect through her willingness to treat anyone regardless of their ability to pay. Her office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building, with living quarters above and a small surgery that doubled as a general examination room. She opened the door before Jim could knock, having observed the commotion from her window and correctly deduced that medical attention would be required. "Bring her inside," she said briskly, leading them to the examination table while shooting curious glances at Kate's unusual attire. What happened? Twisted ankle, exhaustion, possibly dehydration, Jim reported with the concise accuracy of someone accustomed to describing livestock injuries. She collapsed getting off the train. Dr. Whitman nodded and began her examination with professional thoroughness, asking Kate gentle questions about pain levels and recent food intake while carefully removing her torn stockings to assess the ankle injury. The joint showed significant swelling and bruising, though Whitman's careful manipulation suggested no broken bones. Severe sprain, she announced, beginning to wrap the ankle with practiced efficiency. You'll need to stay off this foot for at least a week, longer if you want it to heal properly. When did you last eat a full meal? Kate's hesitation provided its own answer, and Whitman frowned with disapproval that seemed directed at circumstances rather than the patient herself. Malnutrition and exhaustion, she continued, addressing Jim as though Kate couldn't hear. She needs rest, regular meals, and someone to ensure she follows medical instructions. Do you have family in the area? The question caused Kate's composure to crumble completely. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she shook her head, unable to find words for the complexity of her situation. Jim felt something twist in his chest at the sight of her distress, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since Anna's illness had revealed how helpless he could feel in the face of suffering. "She stay at my ranch," he heard himself saying, the words emerging with such quiet certainty that even he was surprised by the decision. "Until she's recovered and has had time to make other arrangements." Dr. Whitman raised an eyebrow at this unexpected development, but said nothing about the social implications of a single man offering shelter to an unaccompanied woman. Frontier life often demanded practical solutions that ignored conventional propriety, and she'd witnessed enough human suffering to appreciate genuine compassion when she encountered it. Kate looked up at Jim with an expression that mixed gratitude, disbelief, and the kind of desperate hope that came from having exhausted all other options. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered. "I might bring trouble to your door." Jim met her gaze steadily, seeing past the fear to something deeper and more fundamental. "Everyone's running from something," he said simply. "The question is whether you're running towards something better." The words seemed to resonate with Kate in ways that went beyond their immediate situation. She straightened slightly, finding reserves of strength she hadn't known still existed, and nodded with the first trace of determination she'd shown since stepping off the train. "I am," she said quietly. "I'm running toward whatever comes next." Jim Harper had made his decision, though he couldn't yet comprehend how completely it would transform both their lives. As he helped Kate from the examination table and prepared to take her home to the Broken Arrow Ranch, neither of them suspected that her arrival would set in motion events that would test everything they believed about love, justice, and the courage required to build a life worth living. The afternoon sun climbed higher over Copper Creek as Jim's wagon rolled toward the ranch, carrying a wounded woman whose story had only begun to unfold and a lonely man who was about to discover that some rescues save the rescuer as much as the rescued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, unexpected revelations, and the kind of love that grows not from fairy tale romance, but from two broken souls learning to trust again. But for now, there was only the steady rhythm of horse hooves on dirt road, the vast Montana sky stretching endlessly above them, and the first tentative hope that perhaps, sometimes, running away was actually the first step toward running home. The wagon wheels found every rut and stone on the road back to Broken Arrow Ranch, each jolt sending fresh waves of pain through Kate's injured ankle. She gritted her teeth and clutched the wooden seat, determined not to cry out despite the agony that seemed to radiate from her foot up through her entire leg. The wedding dress, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, now felt like a costume from someone else's life, its torn fabric catching on splinters and its weight pulling at her shoulders with every movement. Jim had fashioned a makeshift cushion from horse blankets, arranging them carefully in the wagon bed to provide what comfort he could manage. His consideration touched her in ways she hadn't expected, this quiet kindness from a stranger who asked nothing in return. She studied his profile as he guided the horses with steady hands, noting the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie sun and the careful way he navigated around the worst of the road's imperfections to minimize her discomfort. Rex trotted alongside the wagon with boundless energy, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting scents before returning to his position as their unofficial escort. The dog's presence provided an oddly comforting normalcy to what felt like the most surreal day of Kate's life. Just this morning, she'd been preparing to marry Samuel Morrison in Chicago's most fashionable church, surrounded by society's elite and her family's expectations. Now she was fleeing across the Montana territory in a stranger's wagon, her entire world reduced to the contents of a hastily packed carpet bag. The landscape rolled past in endless waves of golden grass, punctuated by stands of cottonwood trees. That marked the presence of hidden streams. Mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks touched with snow that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Kate had never seen country so vast and empty, where the horizon seemed to stretch beyond the edge of imagination. After the crowded streets and towering buildings of Chicago, the sheer scale of this place made her feel simultaneously liberated and utterly insignificant. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the pain, and partly because the silence had grown heavy with unspoken questions. Jim considered the question as though it required careful calculation. "Born in Kansas," he said finally. "Came out here with my wife Anna about 8 years ago. We wanted to build something of our own, somewhere the land was still available, to people willing to work for it." The past tense didn't escape Kate's notice, and she found herself wondering what had happened to Anna Harper. The careful way Jim spoke her name suggested loss rather than abandonment, and Kate felt a familiar ache of recognition. She'd learned to identify grief in others, having carried her own burden of sorrow since her mother's death 3 years earlier. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it despite her current circumstances. "Frightening, but beautiful." Jim nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Anna used to say the prairie could make you feel like the only person in the world, or like you were part of something bigger than yourself, depending on your mood. He paused, then added more quietly, "I reckon it depends on whether you're running towards something or away from it." The words settled between them like dust, carrying more weight than their simple construction suggested. Kate found herself studying this man who spoke so carefully, who offered shelter without demanding explanations, who seemed to understand something fundamental about the nature of refuge. She wondered what had taught him such lessons, what experiences had carved those lines of compassion into features that might otherwise have appeared stern. The Broken Arrow Ranch announced itself gradually, first through the sight of fence posts marching across rolling hills, then the distant shapes of cattle gathered near a stock pond, and finally the cluster of buildings that comprised Jim's homestead. Kate felt her breath catch as the wagon crested a small rise, and the full scope of the property spread before them like a painting of frontier dreams made manifest. The house stood solid and welcoming against the backdrop of endless sky, its white clapboard siding bright in the afternoon, sun despite the weathering that spoke of prairie storms survived and seasons endured. A wide porch wrapped around the front and side, supported by posts that showed the careful craftsmanship of someone who understood that beauty and function could coexist. Windows faced east and west to catch the morning and evening light, and Kate could see the flower boxes Jim had mentioned, though they sat empty now except for dried stems that rattled in the wind. The red barn dominated the space behind the house, its doors standing open to reveal the shadowy interior where horses moved with lazy contentment. Chickens scratched in the dirt nearby, their complaints carrying clearly across the yard as they protested some perceived injustice in their daily routine. A vegetable garden showed signs of recent attention, its neat rows speaking of someone who understood the necessity of planning ahead in country, where the nearest store lay miles away. But it was the sense of order and purpose that impressed Kate most deeply. Everything had its place and function, from the woodpile stacked with geometric precision to the tools hanging in organized rows along the barn wall. This wasn't just a ranch. It was a home built by people who intended to stay, who had invested not just money but dreams in its creation. Anna chose the spot for the house, Jim said, noticing Kate's careful survey of the property. Said it needed to face the sunrise so we'd start each day with hope. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch and set the brake with practiced efficiency. I think she was right about that. Kate felt tears threaten again at the gentleness in his voice when he spoke of his deceased wife. The love was still there, she realized, not diminished by death, but transformed into something that honored memory while acknowledging loss. She wondered if she would ever speak of someone with such tender devotion, if the capacity for that kind of love still existed within her after everything Samuel had destroyed. Jim climbed down from the wagon. Seaton moved around to help Kate descend, his movements efficient but careful. The injured ankle made the process awkward, and she found herself leaning heavily against his solid strength as he guided her down. The wedding dress caught on everything, its elaborate construction never intended for such practical challenges. And Kate felt a sudden fierce hatred for the garment that had once represented her dreams. I must look ridiculous, she muttered, struggling with the torn train that kept tangling around her legs. Jin paused in his assistance to meet her eyes directly. You look like someone who's been through something difficult and came out the other side, he said simply. That's not ridiculous. That's brave. The words hit Kate with unexpected force, cutting through layers of shame and self-doubt that had accumulated during her desperate flight. When was the last time someone had called her brave? When had anyone looked at her and seen strength rather than weakness, courage rather than foolishness? She felt something shift inside her chest, a small flame of self-worth that she'd thought Samuel had extinguished completely. Rex bounded ahead of them as Jim helped Kate navigate the porch steps, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a host eager to show off his domain. The dog paused at the front door, looking back as though seeking permission to proceed, and Jim nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested years of such communication. The interior of the house embraced Kate like a warm blanket, its rooms designed for comfort rather than display. The front door opened directly into a living area dominated by a stone fireplace that showed evidence of regular use. Handmade furniture filled the space, pieces crafted with the same careful attention to detail that marked everything else about the ranch. Bookshelves lined one wall, their contents suggesting owners who valued learning, entertainment in equal measure. But it was the touches of feminine influence that caught Kate's attention most sharply. Embroidered pillows softened the angles of wooden chairs. Delicate curtains filtered the harsh prairie light, and small decorations spoke of someone who had worked to make this house a home rather than merely a shelter. Anna's presence lingered in every carefully chosen detail, from the china cabinet, displaying dishes too fine for everyday use, to the quilted throw draped over the back of the sofa. She had good taste, Kate said softly, running her fingers over the smooth surface of a side table that showed the patina of loving care. Jim's smile held both sadness and pride. Anna could make anything beautiful, he agreed. Said there was no point in living somewhere that didn't feed the soul as well as the body. He gestured toward a hallway that led deeper into the house. The guest room is this way. It's not fancy, but it's clean and comfortable. Kate followed him slowly, her injured ankle making each step a careful negotiation. The hallway walls displayed photographs of the ranch in various stages of development, showing the progression from raw land to established homestead. She paused before one image that showed Jim and a woman standing proudly in front of the newly completed house, their faces radiant with accomplishment and mutual affection. Anna Harper had been lovely in the way that prairie flowers were lovely, her beauty enhanced by the strength and character that shone from her eyes. She stood close to Jim in the photograph, their bodies angled toward each other with the unconscious intimacy of people who had found their perfect complement. Kate felt a stab of envy so sharp it took her breath away, not jealousy of a dead woman, but longing for the kind of partnership that photograph represented. The guest room proved to be everything Jim had promised, furnished simply but thoughtfully. With a bed that looked comfortable enough to sleep in for a week, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a wardrobe that could hold whatever clothes Kate might acquire to replace her ruined wedding dress. Windows on 2 walls provided cross-ventilation and views of the ranch that would allow her to watch the daily rhythm of Jim's work. "There are some of Anna's things in the wardrobe," Jim said, his voice carefully neutral. "I never got around to packing them away. You're welcome to use whatever fits until you can arrange for something else." The offer hit Kate like a physical blow, its generosity so unexpected and profound that she struggled to find adequate words of gratitude. To be offered not just shelter but the clothing of a beloved deceased wife spoke to a level of trust and compassion that she'd never experienced from anyone, let alone a stranger. "I can't," she whispered, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his kindness. "Those things are precious to you." Jim studied her face for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully before responding. "Anna always said her clothes were meant to be worn, not preserved like museum pieces," he said finally. "She'd be happy to know they were helping someone who needed them." Kate sank into the room's single chair, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the day's events. The wedding dress felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, its torn fabric a constant reminder of everything she'd lost and left behind. Thought of removing it, of stepping out of the costume of her former life and into clothes that belonged to someone who had been truly loved, seemed both terrifying and necessary. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, needing to understand his motivations before accepting such overwhelming generosity. "You don't know anything about me. I could be a criminal, a liar, someone who brings nothing but trouble." Jim leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful as he considered her question. "I reckon everyone deserves a chance to start over," he said slowly. "Anna and I came here with nothing but hope and willingness to work. Someone gave you us that chance, and we built something good from it." He paused, then added more quietly, "Besides, I recognize the look of someone who's been hurt. I had that same look after Anna died, like the world had turned cruel and I didn't know how to trust it anymore." The perceptiveness of his observation shattered Kate's remaining composure. Tears streamed down her cheeks as months of suppressed fear and pain finally found their outlet. She wept for the naive girl who had believed Samuel's promises, for the woman who had nearly married a monster, for the life she'd been forced to abandon and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Jim didn't try to comfort her with empty words or awkward gestures. Instead, he simply remained present, his quiet strength providing anchor point while she grieved everything she'd lost. When the storm of tears finally subsided, he handed her a clean handkerchief without comment and waited until she was ready to continue. "I was supposed to marry Samuel Morrison this morning," Kate said finally, the words emerging in a rush as though speaking them quickly might lessen their power to wound. "One of the wealthiest men in Chicago, according to my father. A perfect match for the Sullivan family's social ambitions." She twisted the handkerchief between her fingers, struggling to find words for experiences that seemed too dark for this sunlit room. "I discovered things about him, about his business dealings, about what he was capable of doing to people who crossed him. When I tried to break the engagement, he made it clear that wasn't an option." Jim's jaw tightened with controlled anger, though his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "What kind of things?" Kate hesitated, wondering how much she dared reveal to this man who had already shown her more kindness than she deserved. The weight of the secrets she carried felt crushing, but the need to unburden herself to someone who might understand proved stronger than caution. "He owns buildings in the worst parts of the city, places where families pay impossible rents for rooms that aren't fit for animals," she began slowly. "When they can't pay, his men evict them regardless of weather or circumstances. I saw the documents. Jim, families with children thrown into the streets in the middle of winter because Samuel Morrison needed to make an example." The words came faster now, as though a dam had burst inside her chest. "He has connections with men who import workers from other countries, promising them good jobs and fair wages. Instead, they're trapped in factories that are little better than prisons, working 16-hour days for barely enough to survive. Anyone who complains or tries to organize the others simply disappears." Jim's hands had clenched into fists at his sides, his normally calm demeanor cracking to reveal the anger beneath. "And your family knew about this?" Kate's laugh held. No humor, only bitter recognition of hard truths. "My father knew Samuel was ruthless in business. He considered it an asset, proof that Samuel could provide the kind of security and social standing the Sullivan family required." She met Jim's eyes directly, needing him to understand the full scope of her betrayal. "I was raised to be an ornament, Jim, pretty, well-educated enough to make interesting conversation, but never taught to think for myself or question the men who controlled my life." The admission hung between them like smoke, carrying the acrid taste of shame and regret. Kate had never spoken these truths aloud, had barely acknowledged them to herself until the morning she discovered the full extent of Samuel's cruelty and realized she couldn't live with the consequences of willful ignorance. "What changed?" Jim asked quietly. Kate closed her eyes, remembering the moment that had shattered her comfortable self-deception forever. "I went to his office to discuss wedding arrangements. He wasn't there, but his desk was covered with photographs and documents that his secretary hadn't had time to put away." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Pictures of beaten workers, reports detailing which men were problems that needed to be eliminated, correspondence with officials who were being paid to look the other way." She opened her eyes to find Jim watching her with an expression of such compassion that it nearly undid her fragile composure again. "I confronted him that evening, told him I couldn't marry someone capable of such things. He laughed, Jim. He actually laughed and said it didn't matter what I could or couldn't do, because I belonged to him now and would do exactly what I was told." The memory of Samuel's casual dismissal of her autonomy sent fresh waves of anger and humiliation through Kate's chest. She remembered the way he'd gripped her wrist hard enough to leave bruises, the cold calculation in his eyes as he detailed exactly what would happen to her and her family if she attempted to embarrass him by backing out of their engagement. "I realized then that I'd never been anything more than another acquisition to him," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "A pretty thing to display at social functions, someone to bear his children and maintain his household, while he continued destroying lives for profit." She straightened in her chair, finding reserves of determination she hadn't known still existed. "I couldn't do it, Jim. I couldn't spend my life pretending not to see the blood on his hands." Jim nodded slowly, understanding flooding his features. As the pieces of Kate's story fell into place, "So you ran." "I took the evidence," Kate said simply. "Documents, photographs, correspondence that proves what he's been doing. I thought if I could get them to the right authorities, to newspapers that couldn't be bought, maybe I could stop him from hurting more people." The revelation transformed everything about Kate's presence at his ranch. She wasn't just a runaway bride seeking refuge. She was a woman who had risked everything to expose corruption and protect innocent people from a predator. The courage that had required, the strength of character it demonstrated, made Jim see her in an entirely new light. He'll come after you, Jim said, stating the obvious truth they both understood. Kate nodded, fresh fear flickering in her eyes. He has resources, connections, men who specialize in finding people who don't want to be found. She gestured toward her torn wedding dress with bitter humor. I'm not exactly inconspicuous in this outfit. It's only a matter of time before someone recognizes the description and reports my location. Jim was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of harboring a fugitive from one of Chicago's most powerful men. The smart thing would be to help Kate reach the next town, provide her with supplies and transportation to continue her flight. Keeping her at the ranch put both of them at risk and invited the kind of trouble that could destroy everything he'd built. But as he looked at this brave, broken woman who had sacrificed everything to stand against injustice, Jim found that the smart choice held no appeal whatsoever. Anna had always said that sometimes doing the right thing required ignoring what was safe or easy, and he could almost hear her voice urging him to offer protection to someone who needed it so desperately. Then we'll have to make sure they don't find you, he said finally, his tone carrying the quiet determination that had seen him through drought, harsh winters, and the devastating loss of his wife. Kate stared at him in disbelief, unable to process the simple certainty with which he'd committed himself to her cause. You don't understand what you're saying, she protested. Samuel has killed people for less than what you're offering. If he finds out you're helping me. Let me worry about Samuel Morrison, Jim interrupted, his voice carrying a hard edge that suggested depths of strength Kate hadn't yet glimpsed. Right now you need rest, food, and time for that ankle to heal. Everything else can wait until tomorrow. As if summoned by mention of food, Kate's stomach growled audibly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the previous evening. The sound made her blush with embarrassment, but Jim only smiled with the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him since their meeting. I'll put together something simple, he said, moving toward the door. Anna's clothes are in the wardrobe, and there's water in the pitcher for washing. Take whatever time you need to get settled. He paused at the threshold, looking back with an expression that mixed determination and something that might have been the beginning of protective affection. Kate Sullivan, you're safe here. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Kate alone with her thoughts and the overwhelming realization that she might have found something she'd never dared hope for, a man who would stand beside her not because he owned her or wanted something from her, but because it was the right thing to do. Outside her window, the Montana sun continued its journey toward the western mountains, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber that spoke of endings and beginnings intertwined. Kate rose slowly from her chair and moved toward the wardrobe, ready to shed the costume of her former life and step into whatever came next. The wedding dress fell to the floor in a pool of torn silk and broken dreams, and for the first time since boarding the train in Chicago, Kate Sullivan felt like she might actually have a future worth fighting for. Dawn arrived with the gentle persistence of prairie light, seeping through the guest room windows to find Kate already awake, staring at the ceiling with eyes that had seen too little sleep. The events of the previous day felt like fragments of someone else's life, too surreal and overwhelming to belong to the woman who had once spent her mornings choosing between silk gloves and deciding which charity luncheon deserved her attendance. Now she lay in a stranger's bed, wearing a dead woman's nightgown, listening to the sounds of a working ranch coming to life. Jim's voice drifted through the morning air as he spoke to his animals, his tone carrying the kind of easy affection reserved for creatures who offered companionship without judgment. Kate heard the creak of barn doors opening, the lowing of cattle eager for their morning feed, and the cheerful complaint of chickens demanding attention to their perceived emergencies. These sounds painted a picture of routine and purpose that felt both foreign and deeply appealing to someone whose life had been governed by social obligations rather than meaningful work. The blue dress she had chosen from Anna's wardrobe fit reasonably well, though it required some adjustments to accommodate their different proportions. Anna had been slightly taller and more slender, but the careful tailoring spoke of clothes made to last rather than follow fleeting fashion. The fabric felt substantial beneath Kate's fingers, chosen for durability and comfort rather than display, and she found herself appreciating the practical wisdom that had guided such choices. Standing before the small mirror above the washstand, Kate barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Gone was the elaborately coiffed socialite with her perfectly arranged curls and carefully applied cosmetics. In her place stood someone who looked remarkably ordinary, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face free of the powder and rouge that had once seemed essential to her identity. The transformation was both liberating and terrifying. Stripping away the armor of privilege to reveal someone she wasn't entirely sure she knew. The kitchen welcomed her with warmth and the rich aroma of coffee brewing on the cast-iron stove. Jim stood at the counter with his back to her, methodically slicing bread with the focused attention he seemed to bring to every task. He had already dressed for the day's work, his clothes practical and worn soft with use, and Kate found herself studying the capable way he moved through morning preparations. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him but feeling awkward about standing silently in the doorway. Jim turned with a smile that transformed his weathered features, genuine pleasure at seeing her upright and moving around. "Morning. How's the ankle feeling?" Kate tested her weight gingerly, pleased to discover that Dr. Whitman's treatment had already begun to show results. "Much better, thank you. Still tender, but I can walk without wanting to cry." "That's progress." Jim gestured toward the kitchen table, which had been set for two with simple white dishes and sturdy silverware. "Breakfast is nothing fancy. Eggs, bacon, biscuits that didn't burn this time. Coffee's strong enough to wake the dead, the way Anna always made it." The casual mention of his wife surprised Kate with its lack of pain. Jim spoke of Anna the way people spoke of beloved friends who lived far away, with affection unclouded by the desperate grief that had marked his earlier references. She wondered if her presence was somehow helping him remember joy rather than loss, or if time had simply begun its healing work in ways too subtle to notice day by day. The meal proved to be far better than Jim's modest description suggested. The eggs were cooked perfectly, the bacon crisp without being overdone, and the biscuits revealed themselves to be light and buttery, despite his disclaimers about his baking skills. Kate ate with the grateful attention of someone rediscovering the pleasure of food after days of anxiety that had stolen her appetite. "You're a better cook than you pretend to be," she observed, reaching for a second biscuit, despite her intention to eat sparingly. Jim's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment. "Anna did most of the cooking when she was alive. I had to learn fast after she passed, unless I wanted to live on hardtack and jerky." He poured more coffee into both their cups, the domestic gesture feeling surprisingly natural. "Trial and error taught me that paying attention makes all the difference between edible and disaster." The conversation flowed with unexpected ease as they shared the morning meal. Jim asked careful questions about Kate's life in Chicago, showing genuine interest in experiences so different from his own. She found herself describing the elaborate social rituals that had governed her days, the endless round of visits and entertainments that now seemed as foreign as customs from another country. "It sounds exhausting," Jim observed when she finished recounting a typical week of her former life. "All that effort put into appearances and obligations. When did you have time to think about what you actually wanted?" The question hit Kate with startling force, revealing a truth she had never examined too closely. "I don't think I ever did," she admitted slowly. "I was raised to want what was expected of me, to find satisfaction in meeting other people's standards of success." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully, watching the cream swirl into brown spirals. It's frightening to realize how little I know about my own preferences when they're not shaped by someone else's approval. Jim nodded with the understanding of someone who had faced his own reckonings with authentic desire. Anna used to say that most people spent so much energy being who they thought they should be that they forgot to discover who they actually were. He gestured toward the window, where morning light revealed the vast expanse of his property. Coming out here forced us to strip away everything that wasn't essential. You learn fast what matters when you're building from nothing. Kate followed his gaze, seeing the ranch with new appreciation for what it represented. This wasn't just land and buildings. It was the physical manifestation of two people's shared vision, their willingness to risk everything for the chance to create something entirely their own. The courage that required seemed almost incomprehensible to someone who had never made a significant decision without consulting family expectations. "What would you have done differently?" she asked impulsively. "If you could go back to Chicago and start over, knowing what you know now." Jim considered the question seriously, his expression thoughtful as he weighed possibilities against realities. "I'd have trusted my instincts sooner," he said finally. "About people, about what kind of life would make me happy, about the difference between security and safety." He met her eyes directly. Security is having enough money and social position to protect yourself from most problems. Safety is being surrounded by people who would never let you face those problems alone. The distinction resonated through Kate's chest like a bell struck true, clarifying something she had sensed but never articulated. Her engagement to Samuel had promised ultimate security, the kind of wealth and social prominence that would insulate her from ordinary concerns. But she had never felt safe with him, never experienced the bone-deep trust that comes from knowing someone sees you clearly and chooses to stay anyway. "I've never felt safe," she said quietly, the admission surprising her with its honesty. "Not really. Even as a child, I understood that love came with conditions, that approval had to be earned through perfect behavior and meeting expectations." She traced patterns on the tablecloth with her finger, gathering courage for deeper truth. "When I was 8, I overheard my parents discussing whether to send me to boarding school. My father said it would be worth the expense if it made me more attractive to better families when marriage time came. I realized then that I was an investment, not a daughter." Jim's jaw tightened with controlled anger, though his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "That's not love, Kate. That's ownership dressed up in pretty words." "I know that now," she replied, straightening in her chair as conviction strengthened her voice. "But it took discovering Samuel's true nature to understand the difference. The way he looked at me, spoke about our future, it was exactly the same as my parents. I was property to be managed, not a person to be cherished." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch, multiple horses moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Jim rose immediately, his body language shifting from relaxed host to alert guardian as he moved toward the window. Kate felt her heart begin to race, fear flooding her system with memories of Samuel's threats and the certainty that his reach extended far beyond Chicago's city limits. "3 riders," Jim reported, his voice calm despite the tension that had entered his posture. "Don't recognize them, but they're dressed too well for ranch work." He turned back to Kate, noting the panic in her eyes. "Could be nothing, but let's not take chances. There's a root cellar behind the kitchen, with an entrance hidden by the pantry. Can you make it that far on your ankle?" Kate nodded, adrenaline overriding pain as survival instincts sharpened her focus. Jim led her quickly through the house, pushing aside a heavy wooden cabinet to reveal a narrow door that opened onto steep stairs descending into darkness. The space below had been carved from the earth itself, lined with stone and equipped with shelves that held preserved food and emergency supplies. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear," Jim instructed, pressing a loaded pistol into her hands despite her startled protest. "If something happens to me, wait until full dark, then take Clementine and ride to town." Find Sheriff Bradley and tell him everything." Before Kate could respond to the terrifying implications of his words, Jim had closed the door above her and rearranged the cabinet to conceal her hiding place. She crouched in the musty darkness, listening to his footsteps as he walked calmly toward the front door to greet his unexpected visitors. The voices carried clearly through the wooden floors above her head. 3 men, as Jim had reported, their accents marking them as city-born, despite their attempts to adopt frontier mannerisms. They introduced themselves as federal marshals investigating reports of a missing woman, producing documents that sounded official enough to satisfy casual inspection. "Catherine Sullivan," the apparent leader announced, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Dark hair, brown eyes, about 25 years old. Last seen boarding a westbound train in Chicago 3 days ago. Her family is quite concerned about her welfare. Jim's response revealed nothing of the tension Kate knew he must be feeling. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description, Marshal. Not many single women pass through this area, and word travels fast when they do. Mind if we look around?" Another voice asked, though the question carried the weight of demand rather than request. "We have reason to believe she might be injured and seeking shelter. Wouldn't want her to come to harm while we're out here searching." Kate pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. These weren't federal marshals, she realized with growing horror. The careful phrasing, the emphasis on her supposed family's concern, the underlying threat disguised as protective interest, all bore Samuel's fingerprints. He had found her far more quickly than she had dared fear, his resources proving even more extensive than her worst nightmares had suggested. "I suppose that would be all right," Jim said slowly, his tone suggesting reluctance overcome by civic duty. "Though I should mention that my dog doesn't take kindly to strangers poking around where they don't belong. Rex has a protective streak that doesn't always distinguish between friend and foe." Kate heard the men's footsteps as they began their search, moving through the house with the systematic thoroughness of professionals. They examined every room, opened every closet, looked under beds and behind furniture with the kind of attention that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. One of them lingered in the guest room, and Kate held her breath as she imagined him studying the signs of recent occupation. "Someone's been staying here," the man announced, his voice sharp with discovery. "Bed's been slept in recently, and there are women's clothes in the wardrobe." Jim's explanation came without hesitation, smooth and believable in its simplicity. "My sister-in-law visits sometimes, helps with the household tasks I'm not much good at. She left yesterday morning to visit friends in the next county over." "What's her name?" came the immediate challenge. "Mary Patterson. Lives about 30 miles south with her husband Frank. They run cattle on the Bar Double P spread." Kate marveled at the effortless way Jim constructed his fiction, providing just enough detail to sound authentic without offering information that could be easily verified. His calm demeanor had to be costing him enormous effort, but no trace of strain colored his voice as he answered increasingly aggressive questions. The search continued for what felt like hours, what was probably only minutes, each footstep above Kate's head marking another moment of danger survived. She clutched the pistol Jim had given her, wondering if she would have the courage to use it if discovery became inevitable. The thought of bringing violence to this peaceful ranch filled her with revulsion, but the alternative of allowing herself to be dragged back to Samuel seemed infinitely worse. Finally, the footsteps converged near the front door, and Kate heard the rustle of papers being consulted. "We'll be checking with other ranches in the area," the leader announced. "If this woman shows up, there's a substantial reward for information, leading to her safe return. $500 for anyone who can provide her location." The sum represented more money than most frontier families saw in a year, a temptation calculated to overcome loyalty or conscience. Kate felt despair wash over her as she realized how effectively Samuel had stacked the odds against her. Even people who might normally offer shelter to someone in need would be hard-pressed to ignore such a windfall, especially when presented as a humanitarian gesture rather than a bounty on her head. "I'll keep that in mind," Jim replied evenly. "Though like I said, word travels fast out here. If she'd passed through, I would have heard about it by now." The men mounted their horses with obvious reluctance, clearly frustrated by their failure to find evidence of Kate's presence. Their leader made one final attempt to shake Jim's story, his voice carrying barely concealed menace. "You seem awful calm for someone whose property just got searched by federal marshals, Harper. Most folks would be asking more questions, wanting to know why we're really here." Jim's chuckle sounded genuinely amused, a masterpiece of casual indifference. "Marshal, I've got cattle to feed, fences to mend, and a dozen other chores that won't wait for curiosity. As long as you're not here to arrest me or confiscate my land, your business is your own." The horse's hoofbeats gradually faded into the distance, but Jim waited a full hour before returning to free Kate from her hiding place. She emerged from the root cellar on shaking legs, the pistol clutched in hands that trembled with delayed reaction to terror. The casual way the false marshals had discussed her capture, the reward that would turn every stranger into a potential enemy, the efficiency with which Samuel had tracked her across half the continent, all combined to paint a picture of hopelessness that threatened to overwhelm her fragile courage. "They'll be back," she said, voicing the certainty that filled her chest with cold dread. "Maybe not those three, but others. Samuel won't give up until he finds me." Jim nodded grimly, his own understanding of their situation clear in the hard lines around his eyes. "Then we need to make sure he doesn't succeed." He moved to the kitchen window, scanning the horizon for any sign that the riders might be circling back. "Tell me about these documents you took. How important are they really?" Kate felt a flicker of renewed determination as she remembered the evidence hidden in her carpetbag. Important enough to destroy him completely if they reach the right people. Financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, correspondence detailing which witnesses need to be silenced, photographs of workers who died in his factories. She met Jim's eyes directly. Evidence that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. "And he knows you have them? He has to suspect." "I was in his office the day before our wedding, and some documents went missing afterward. Even if he wasn't certain initially, my disappearance would have confirmed his worst fears." Jim was quiet for several minutes, weighing possibilities and risks with the careful deliberation of someone whose decisions carried life-and-death consequences. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet determination that had seen him through drought, harsh winters, and personal tragedy. "Then we need to get those documents to someone who can use them properly," he said simply. "Someone with the authority and integrity to ensure justice gets done." Kate stared at him in amazement, unable to comprehend how he could speak so calmly about taking on one of Chicago's most powerful men. "Jim, you don't understand what you're suggesting. Samuel has judges, politicians, police officials all in his pocket. Even if we found someone honest enough to pursue the case, they'd be fighting the entire corrupt system he's built." "Maybe," Jim acknowledged. "But doing the right thing isn't about calculating odds or guaranteeing success. It's about standing up to bullies regardless of how big they are or how many friends they have." He moved closer, his presence radiating the kind of steady strength that made impossible things seem merely difficult. "Anna used to say that evil only wins when good people decide the fight isn't worth the risk." The words struck Kate like lightning, illuminating truths she had never dared acknowledge. All her life, she had been taught to avoid conflict, to accommodate and appease rather than confront injustice directly. Even her flight from Samuel had been motivated more by self-preservation than moral courage, an attempt to escape rather than fight. But this man, this quiet rancher who owed her nothing and had everything to lose, was offering to stand with her against forces that could destroy them both. The magnitude of his courage shamed her previous cowardice and inspired her to reach for strength she wasn't sure she possessed. "There might be someone," she said slowly, remembering conversations overheard at social gatherings where Samuel's enemies were discussed with careful discretion. "Judge Harrison Blackwood in Denver. He's built a reputation for refusing bribes and going after corruption, regardless of how powerful the people involved might be. If anyone would take this case seriously, it would be him." Jim nodded approvingly. "Denver's not that far, and I know people there who could arrange a meeting. But getting you there safely will be the challenge, especially now that they know you're in the area." Kate felt a surge of gratitude so profound it threatened to overwhelm her composure once again. This man had already risked everything to shelter her, and now he was proposing to extend that protection into active resistance against her pursuers. The generosity of spirit it represented, the fundamental decency that would drive someone to such lengths for a stranger, restored something in her soul that Samuel's cruelty had nearly destroyed. "Why?" she asked, needing to understand the motivations that could inspire such selfless courage. "Why are you willing to do this for me?" Jim considered the question seriously, his expression thoughtful as he searched for words adequate to explain impulses that ran deeper than logic. "I suppose because standing by and watching evil triumph feels like betraying everything Anna and I believed in when we built this place," he said finally. "We came here to create something good, something clean, something worth preserving. Letting men like Samuel Morrison destroy innocent lives would make all of that meaningless." He paused, then added more quietly, "And because I've seen what it looks like when someone finds the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs them everything. You could have married him, Kate, could have lived comfortably while pretending not to see the blood on his hands. Instead, you chose to risk everything to protect people you don't even know." The words wrapped around Kate's heart like warm blankets, offering comfort and validation she hadn't realized she desperately needed. For the first time since fleeing Chicago, she felt like she might actually deserve the protection being offered. That her actions might have been born from principle rather than simple cowardice. "What do we do now?" she asked, ready to follow his lead wherever it might take them. Jim's smile held the fierce satisfaction of someone who had found purpose worth fighting for. "Now we plan how to get you to Denver alive, and we make sure Samuel Morrison learns what happens when he threatens people under my protection." Outside the kitchen window, storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, their dark presence promising weather that would either shelter their plans or complicate them beyond endurance. But for the first time since boarding the train in Chicago, Kate felt something stronger than fear filling her chest. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The plan they devised over the following 3 days was both elegant and dangerous, requiring precise timing and more than a little luck to succeed. Jim had connections in Denver through his cattle trading, men who could arrange a private meeting with Judge Blackwood without alerting Samuel's network of informants. But getting Kate there alive would require crossing 200 miles of open territory while Samuel's bounty hunters scoured every trail in town between Copper Creek and Colorado. Kate spent her recovery time helping with ranch chores, her injured ankle gradually strengthening under Dr. Whitman's prescribed regimen of careful exercise and rest. The simple tasks of gathering eggs, tending the vegetable garden, and helping prepare meals provided welcome distraction from the constant awareness of danger lurking beyond the ranch's boundaries. Together, they would watch their children chase chickens and climb hay bales, secure in the knowledge that they had built something worthy of protection, and proud of the price they'd been willing to pay for the privilege. The prairie wind that sang through the grass around their home carried no trace of the loneliness that had once marked Jim Harper's existence. Instead, it whispered of second chances seized and courage rewarded, of love that grew not from fairy tale romance, but from the deeper bond that forms between people who choose to stand together against whatever challenges the world might offer. Sometimes the people we're waiting for never come, but sometimes the ones who arrive instead teach us that we were waiting for the wrong things entirely. Kate Sullivan had boarded a train seeking escape and found instead a home worth fighting for, a man worth loving, and the strength to become someone worth being. The wounded bride who had collapsed at a remote train station had discovered that healing sometimes requires not just bandages and rest, but the courage to trust again and the wisdom to recognize when you've finally found the place where you belong. The autumn days that followed brought an unexpected rhythm to Kate's life at the Broken Arrow Ranch, a cadence of meaningful work and quiet companionship that felt more natural than anything she had experienced in her 25 years of carefully orchestrated existence. Each morning began with the soft glow of sunrise filtering through her bedroom curtains, followed by the gentle sounds of Jim beginning his daily rounds with the livestock. She had taken to rising early herself, drawn by an inexplicable desire to witness the daily miracle of the ranch awakening to another day of purposeful activity. The kitchen had become their meeting place, a sanctuary where conversation flowed as easily as the coffee. Jim brewed with the same careful attention he brought to every task. Kate had begun contributing her own efforts to their morning meals, discovering that she possessed more aptitude for domestic skills than her privileged upbringing had allowed her to develop. Under Jim's patient guidance, she learned to judge when bacon was perfectly crisp, how to flip pancakes without creating disasters, and the precise timing required to produce biscuits that were light and golden rather than heavy doorstops. These simple accomplishments filled her with a satisfaction that her former life of elaborate social functions and expensive entertainments had never provided. There was something profoundly satisfying about creating nourishment with her own hands, about contributing meaningfully to the basic necessities of survival rather than merely consuming what others had produced. The calluses forming on her palms from unfamiliar work felt like badges of honor, proof that she was becoming someone capable of genuine contribution rather than ornamental display. Dr. Whitman's daily visits had evolved from strictly medical consultations into social calls that Kate treasured for the connection they provided to the broader community of Copper Creek. The doctor possessed a wealth of stories about the territory's early days, tales of courage and determination that had shaped the character of people who chose to build lives in demanding circumstances. Through these conversations, Kate began to understand the values that bound frontier communities together, the unspoken codes of mutual assistance and personal responsibility that made survival possible in country where official authority remained distant and unreliable. The injured ankle that had brought her to Jim's attention healed with surprising speed, though Kate found herself reluctant to mention her complete recovery. The pretense of continued weakness provided justification for remaining at the ranch, postponing decisions about her future that she wasn't ready to confront. More honestly, she had discovered something at the Broken Arrow that she had never experienced elsewhere, a sense of belonging that owed nothing to social position or family connections and everything to the simple fact that her presence seemed to bring Jim a contentment he hadn't known since Anna's death. Their conversations during evening meals had taken on increasing depth and intimacy, ranging far beyond the safe topics that had characterized their early interactions. Jim spoke of his dreams for expanding the ranch, his hopes for bringing more families to the area, his vision of a community that could offer both prosperity and the kind of mutual support that made life worth living. Kate found herself contributing ideas and perspectives that seemed to genuinely interest him, her years of observation at Chicago society gatherings having provided her with insights into human nature and social dynamics that proved surprisingly applicable to frontier life. More surprisingly, Jim had begun asking for her opinions on decisions that affected the ranch's operation. Should he expand the vegetable garden to include crops that could be sold in town? Would it be wise to invest in breeding stock that could improve the quality of his cattle herd? What did she think about his idea of building a schoolhouse that could serve the scattered families in the surrounding area? These consultations made Kate feel valued in ways that her former life's endless deference and flattery never had, respected for her judgment rather than merely admired for her appearance. The physical transformation Kate was undergoing proved as significant as the emotional changes she was experiencing. The pallor that had marked her as a city dweller was giving way to a healthy tan that spoke of hours spent outdoors, engaged in meaningful activity. Her hands, once soft and carefully manicured, now showed the honest wear of someone who worked with tools and animals rather than merely directing servants. Most remarkably, she had begun to smile spontaneously, her face reflecting genuine contentment, rather than the practiced expressions that had served as social armor in her previous existence. Jim's own transformation was equally remarkable, though perhaps less obvious to casual observation. The grief that had shadowed his features since Anna's death had gradually lifted, replaced by something that resembled hope for the future rather than mere acceptance of loss. He laughed more frequently. His conversation expanded beyond the practical necessities of ranch management, and he had begun making plans that extended beyond simple survival into genuine aspirations for growth and improvement. The question of Kate's permanent status at the ranch hung unspoken between them, neither quite brave enough to address directly what was becoming increasingly obvious to both. Their relationship had evolved far beyond that of rescuer and rescued, moving into territory that felt simultaneously natural and terrifying. The memory of Anna's presence in the house had not diminished, but it had changed character, becoming less a barrier to new affection and more a blessing on the possibility of renewed love. Kate had found herself spending increasing amounts of time in the small parlor where Jim kept his most treasured possessions, including the photographs and mementos that preserved Anna's memory. Rather than feeling intimidated by evidence of his previous happiness, she felt grateful for the glimpse these items provided into the kind of man Jim was when circumstances allowed his full character to flourish. The love he had shared with Anna spoke well of his capacity for devotion and partnership, qualities that made the prospect of winning his affection even more appealing. The afternoon when everything changed began like any other, with Kate helping Jim repair fence posts that had been damaged by a recent storm. The work was physically demanding but satisfying, requiring the kind of coordination and mutual dependence that had become second nature to them over the weeks of working together. Kate had developed genuine skill with tools and materials, her contributions essential rather than merely helpful, and Jim's appreciation for her abilities had evolved into something that looked remarkably like admiration. They were discussing plans for winter preparations when the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, the rhythm of hoofbeats suggesting urgency rather than casual travel. Jim straightened immediately, his expression shifting from relaxed contentment to alert wariness as he counted the riders approaching their property. 3 men, well-mounted and moving with the purposeful determination that marked official business or serious trouble. Sheriff Tom Bradley led the group, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight as he reined in his horse near the fence where Jim and Kate were working. Behind him rode 2 men Kate didn't recognize, their clothing and bearing suggesting they came from outside the immediate area. All 3 carried themselves with the kind of authority that brooked no argument, their expressions serious enough to send cold dread racing through Kate's veins. "Afternoon, Jim," Bradley said, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by official formality. "Need to have a word with you about a matter that's come to our attention." Jim wiped his hands on his work shirt, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the tension Kate could see building in his shoulders. "What kind of matter, Sheriff?" "Missing person case," Bradley replied, his eyes moving meaningfully toward Kate before returning to Jim's face. "Woman named Catherine Sullivan, last seen boarding a westbound train in Chicago. Her family's hired some federal marshals to track her down, bring her home safe. More importantly, they gave her hands something useful to do while her mind processed the magnitude of what lay ahead. Working alongside Jim revealed depths to his character that casual conversation had only hinted at. He possessed the kind of practical intelligence that could solve problems with whatever materials happened to be available, turning broken fence posts into firewood and worn-out horseshoes into door hinges. His patience seemed limitless when teaching her tasks she'd never performed, from milking cows to identifying which plants in the garden were ready for harvest. But it was his quiet strength in the face of mounting pressure that impressed Kate most deeply. When Sheriff Bradley arrived 2 days after the false marshal's visit, asking careful questions about unusual activity in the area, Jim answered with the same calm composure he'd shown to Samuel's men. When Mary Chun appeared at the ranch with gossip about strangers asking questions in town, he listened without betraying any anxiety about what their inquiries might reveal. "You're remarkably good at deception for someone who strikes me as fundamentally honest," Kate observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Jim's smile held no shame, only the practical acceptance of someone who understood that survival sometimes required flexibility with absolute truth. "Anna used to say that lying to protect innocent people wasn't the same as lying for personal gain," he replied. "The intention behind the deception matters as much as the deception itself." Kate nodded, recognizing the wisdom in the distinction, while marveling at how different her world had become. 3 weeks ago, her greatest moral challenge had involved choosing between social obligations that bored her equally. Now she was learning to live with secrets that could cost lives, to find strength in circumstances that would have overwhelmed her former self completely. The evening brought news that changed everything. Ruby Patterson, the neighboring rancher's wife, arrived at sunset with information that sent cold dread through Kate's chest and hardened Jim's expression into something she'd never seen before. Samuel Morrison himself had arrived in Copper Creek that afternoon, accompanied by 6 men, who made no pretense of being anything other than the hired killers they obviously were. "He's offering $1,000 now," Ruby reported, her weathered face grave with concern. "Not just for information, but for the woman herself, delivered alive and unharmed to the hotel where he's staying." She glanced meaningfully at Kate, making it clear that her presence at the ranch was no secret among their neighbors. "There's also word that he's threatening anyone who might be harboring her, talking about charging them as accomplices to theft and kidnapping." Kate felt the bottom drop out of her world as she realized how completely Samuel had outmaneuvered them. The increased reward would tempt even decent people beyond their capacity to resist, while the threat of criminal charges would terrify anyone who might otherwise offer assistance. He had effectively turned the entire territory into a trap, with every stranger a potential captor and every friend a possible betrayer. "We need to leave tonight," she said, rising from her chair with determination that surprised her with its steadiness. "The longer I stay, the more danger I bring to everyone who's helped me." Jim's response was immediate and uncompromising. "You're not going anywhere alone, and you're sure not going back to him." He stood as well, his posture radiating the kind of protective fury that had built the American frontier through stubborn refusal to surrender to impossible odds. "If Samuel Morrison wants to escalate this fight, he'll discover that threatening my family was a mistake. The casual way." He referred to Kate as family sent warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening's lingering heat. She had never belonged to anyone in the way Jim's words implied, never been claimed with such fierce protectiveness by someone who owed her nothing beyond common human decency. The realization that she had somehow earned a place in his life significant enough to risk everything defending brought tears to her eyes and steel to her spine. Ruby Patterson's information proved even more valuable than her warning. Frank had observed Samuel's group carefully during their arrival, noting their weapons, their horses, and the way they positioned themselves around the hotel to prevent anyone from approaching undetected. More crucially, he'd overheard enough conversation to understand that Samuel planned to systematically search every ranch and farm in the area, using his legal threats and financial inducements to force cooperation from landowners who might initially resist. He expects to find her within the week, Ruby continued, accepting the cup of coffee Jim pressed into her hands. Seems confident that someone will crack under the pressure and reveal her location rather than face the consequences of defying him. Kate listened to this assessment of Samuel's strategy with growing appreciation for how thoroughly he had studied his opponents. He understood frontier mentality well enough to know that most people would choose pragmatic submission over heroic resistance when faced with overwhelming force. What he couldn't have anticipated was encountering someone like Jim Harper, whose moral compass pointed toward principles that couldn't be purchased or intimidated. The conversation continued well into the night as they refined their plans to account for Samuel's presence and the increased urgency it created. The original scheme of traveling openly to Denver had become impossible now that every road would be watched and every town would harbor potential informants motivated by fear or greed. Instead, they would need to rely on routes known only to local ranchers, trails used primarily for moving cattle that offered concealment at the cost of adding days to their journey. Jim's knowledge of the territory proved extensive, accumulated through years of driving cattle to market and helping neighbors search for strayed livestock. He sketched maps from memory, marking water sources, shelter locations, and the homesteads of people who could be trusted absolutely to provide assistance without betraying their presence. The network he revealed surprised Kate with its scope, suggesting a community bound together by shared values and mutual dependence that transcended individual self-interest. "We'll leave tomorrow at dawn," Jim decided finally, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Frank and Ruby will spread word that you've already left the area, headed north toward Canada with a family of pilgrims they met at church. That should draw attention away from our actual route while giving us time to reach the first safe house." Kate felt her heart constrict with gratitude and terror in equal measure. The plan required Jim to abandon his ranch for an indefinite period, leaving his cattle and property vulnerable to whatever revenge Samuel might devise. The sacrifice he was making, the trust he was placing in neighbors to protect everything he'd built, demonstrated a level of commitment that left her speechless with appreciation and guilt. "I can't ask you to give up everything for me," she protested, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Your ranch, your life here, the risks you'd face if we're caught, it's too much." Jim's smile held the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found purpose worth any cost. "Kate, you're not asking me to give up anything. You're giving me the chance to stand for something that matters more than cattle, or property, or personal safety." He reached across the table to cover her hand with his own, the gesture simple but profoundly comforting. "Anna would never forgive me if I let fear prevent me from doing what's right." The mention of his deceased wife in this context struck Kate with unexpected force, suggesting that Jim viewed their mission as somehow honoring Anna's memory rather than betraying it. She wondered what kind of woman could inspire such enduring devotion, what qualities Anna Harper had possessed that made her widower see Kate's cause as worthy of ultimate sacrifice. Dawn arrived with the crisp clarity that marked autumn mornings. In Montana, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs and clean enough to make every breath feel like a blessing. Kate had slept little, her mind too active with preparations and possibilities to find rest, but she felt energized by the prospect of finally taking action after days of hiding and waiting. The simple act of movement toward a goal, even one fraught with danger, felt infinitely preferable to the passive vulnerability of remaining static while enemies closed in around them. Jim had loaded their supplies with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood their forgotten necessities, could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Food for a week, ammunition for the rifles they would carry, medical supplies in case injury complicated their journey, and clothing suitable for travel in weather that could turn harsh without warning. He'd also included items Kate wouldn't have thought to pack, from extra horseshoes to a portable sewing kit. Details that spoke of hard-won experience in frontier survival. The horses he'd chosen for their journey reflected similar careful planning. Clementine and a gelding named Duke possessed the stamina and temperament necessary for long days of travel over difficult terrain, while their coloring would blend naturally with the landscape they'd be crossing. Both animals had been shod recently and showed the kind of robust health that suggested they could handle whatever demands the journey might place upon them. Kate had never been much of a rider, her experience limited to gentle trail rides on carefully managed paths near Chicago. The prospect of spending days in the saddle, navigating rough country while maintaining the alertness necessary to avoid capture, intimidated her more than she cared to admit. But Jim's patient instruction over the previous days had built her confidence, and she found herself looking forward to the challenge rather than dreading it. "Remember," Jim said as they made final preparations, "if we encounter anyone unexpected, you're my cousin from Kansas traveling with me to visit relatives in Colorado. We're taking the back trails because you're nervous around strangers and prefer to avoid the main roads." He adjusted the rifle scabbard on his saddle, checking to ensure easy access. "Keep your hat pulled low and let me do the talking unless someone addresses you directly." Kate nodded, understanding that their story needed to be simple enough to remember under pressure, while believable enough to satisfy casual curiosity. The clothes Jim had selected for her supported the deception, practical traveling attire that suggested someone accustomed to ranch life rather than the refined luxury that had once defined her existence. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, following a trail that wound through rolling hills toward the distant mountains. The early morning light painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, revealing a country so vast and beautiful that Kate felt her breath catch with appreciation despite her anxiety about what lay ahead. This was the America her grandparents had described in letters from their own journey west. A land where possibility stretched as far as the eye could see, and freedom came to those brave enough to claim it. The first day passed without incident, their route taking them through country too remote to attract Samuel's attention or that of the bounty hunters he'd surely dispatched to search the more obvious paths. They made good time despite Kate's inexperience, covering nearly 30 miles before stopping at a lime cabin that belonged to one of Jim's friends. The simple shelter provided welcome relief from the day's heat and a secure place to rest while their horses recovered from the journey's demands. That night, as they sat beside a carefully concealed fire eating beans and hardtack, Kate found herself studying Jim's profile in the flickering light. The past week had revealed depths to his character that her first impression had only hinted at, showing her a man whose quiet strength masked considerable complexity. He possessed the kind of courage that didn't announce itself with dramatic gestures, but instead revealed itself through consistent willingness to do whatever circumstances required. What was she like? Kate asked impulsively, curiosity about Anna finally overcoming her reluctance to intrude on painful memories. Jim's expression softened as he considered the question, his eyes growing distant with recollection. "Strong," he said simply. "Not physically, though she could work as hard as any man when necessity demanded it. Strong in ways that mattered. More than muscle, strong enough to leave everything familiar behind and help build something new from nothing." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled darkness. She had this way of seeing possibilities, where other people only saw problems. "When we first arrived here, all I could see was empty land that would require years of back-breaking work to become productive. Anna saw the ranch we could build, the life we could create, the community we could help establish." Kate listened, With growing understanding of what Jim had lost when fever claimed his wife, Anna hadn't just been a companion. She'd been the dreamer who gave direction to his practical skills, the visionary who could imagine futures worth working toward. Her death had taken not just his partner, but his sense of purpose, leaving him adrift in routines that had lost their meaning. "She sounds remarkable," Kate said softly. "She was," Jim agreed, "but I think she'd approve of what we're doing." Anna never could stand bullies, especially ones who used their power to hurt people who couldn't fight back. He looked directly at Kate, his expression serious in the firelight. "She'd want me to see this through, to make sure justice gets done regardless of the cost." The words carried weight that went beyond their immediate meaning, suggesting that Jim viewed their mission as somehow connected to honoring Anna's memory and values. Kate felt humbled by the implication that her cause had become worthy of such dedication, that standing against Samuel Morrison had evolved into something larger than personal revenge, or even simple justice. The second day brought their first real test when they encountered a group of riders moving with the purposeful urgency that marked professional hunters. Jim spotted them first, his experienced eye reading the distant figures long before Kate even noticed their presence. Without a word, he led them off the trail and into a grove of cottonwoods that provided concealment, while allowing them to observe the approaching horsemen. Samuel's men, Kate realized with a chill of recognition. She could see the leader clearly. Now, a lean man with the predatory alertness of someone who made his living through violence. His companions showed the same dangerous competence, their weapons carried with casual familiarity that spoke of frequent use. They were questioning a homesteader about unusual travelers, their tone polite but carrying undertones that suggested cooperation was expected rather than requested. "6 of them," Jim murmured, his voice barely audible as he assessed the threat. Armed and organized, but probably not expecting serious resistance from whoever they're hunting. He checked his rifle, ensuring a round was chambered. "They'll split up to cover more ground, which gives us advantages if we're smart about using them." Kate felt fear twist through her stomach as she watched Samuel's hunters methodically questioning the farmer and his family. The efficiency of their search pattern, the professional way they coordinated their movements, the casual menace they projected even while maintaining superficial courtesy, all confirmed her worst fears about the caliber of men Samuel had brought to find her. But alongside the fear came something else, something harder and more determined than anything she'd felt since fleeing Chicago. These men represented everything she'd run from, the brutal machinery of power that destroyed lives, without conscience or consequence. Letting them succeed, allowing them to drag her back to Samuel's control, would validate every evil deed he'd committed and guarantee that others would suffer similar fates. "I won't go back," she said quietly, her voice carrying conviction that surprised them both with its steel. "Whatever happens here, I won't let him win." Jim nodded approvingly, recognizing the transformation he was witnessing. The frightened socialite who had collapsed at the train station was gone, replaced by someone who had found strength in righteous anger and purpose in resistance to injustice. This was the woman who had risked everything to steal evidence of Samuel's crimes, who had chosen exile and danger over comfortable complicity. The hunters moved on after completing their interrogation, their search pattern taking them away from the hidden travelers. But their presence confirmed that Samuel's net was tightening, that the window for reaching Denver was closing with each passing hour. Jim made the decision to abandon the safer route they'd been following in favor of a more direct path that would cut 2 days from their journey, while exposing them to greater risk of discovery. "We push hard from here," he announced as they prepared to resume travel. "Change horses at the Murphy place tomorrow, ride through the night if necessary. Better to risk exhaustion than give them time to coordinate a proper trap." The third day tested both their endurance and their horses' stamina as they covered ground at a pace that left little margin for rest or caution. The landscape changed as they climbed toward the mountain passes, trading rolling grassland for rocky terrain that offered better concealment at the cost of more difficult travel. Kate's body ached from the constant motion. Her hands cramped from gripping the reins, but she pushed through the discomfort with determination born from knowing that giving up meant worse than death. Evening found them at a trading post run by a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, whose reputation for discretion had made his establishment a way station for travelers who preferred to avoid official attention. Weber took one look at their travel-stained clothes and exhausted horses and asked no questions beyond what they needed for their animals and themselves. "Denver riders came through yesterday," he mentioned casually while serving them stew that tasted like heaven after days of trail rations. City men, asking about a woman traveling with a local guide, offered good money for information, but seemed the sort who'd make poor customers in the long run. Jin nodded acknowledgement of the warning while maintaining the fiction that they were simply relatives traveling to visit family. But Kate could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly checked the room's other occupants and exits. Samuel's men were closer than they'd hoped, their search net tightening around the fugitives with each passing hour. That night, sleeping in the trading post's simple accommodations, Kate found herself listening for sounds that might indicate discovery and capture. Every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind through the eaves, every distant sound from the horses in Weber's stable sent adrenaline shooting through her system. But exhaustion eventually overcame anxiety, and she slept more deeply than she had since leaving the ranch. Dawn brought Klaus Weber's urgent warning that riders were approaching, their purposeful movement and early hour suggesting they weren't casual travelers seeking supplies. Jin and Kate gathered their belongings with practiced efficiency, saddling their horses while Weber delayed the approaching men with the kind of deliberate slowness that frontier hospitality could excuse. They slipped out the trading post's back entrance as Samuel's hunters dismounted at the front, the timing so close that Kate could hear voices through the thin walls as they guided their horses into the cover of surrounding forest. The pursuit had found their trail again, probably through some sign they'd been too tired to conceal properly. And now the final race to Denver would test everything they'd learned about survival and determination. How far? Kate asked as they pushed their tired horses up a steep mountain trail that offered concealment at the cost of brutal physical demands. 20 miles, Jim replied, his voice strained from the effort of controlling his mount on the treacherous footing. Maybe less if we can make the pass before they organize a proper pursuit. The next few hours blurred together in a nightmare of exhaustion, fear, and stubborn refusal to surrender. Their horses labored up grades that seemed impossibly steep, their breathing harsh in the thin mountain air. Behind them, growing steadily closer, came the sound of pursuit, voices calling back and forth as Samuel's men followed their trail with the relentless patience of professional hunters. Kate's world narrowed to the rhythm of her horse's movement. The burning in her lungs from the altitude and the desperate need to keep moving, regardless of how her body protested. Beside her, Jim rode with grim determination, his rifle ready across his saddle, prepared to make their final stand whenever pursuit caught up with their failing strength. The pass appeared suddenly, a notch in the mountains that revealed Denver spread below them like a promised land. The city's buildings caught the afternoon sun, their windows flashing signals of hope and sanctuary that drew the exhausted travelers down the final descent toward safety. Behind them, Samuel's men had fallen back, either discouraged by the difficulty of the terrain or unwilling to pursue their quarry into a city where federal law held more authority than private vengeance. Judge Harrison Blackwood proved to be everything Kate had hoped and more, a man whose reputation for incorruptible integrity was matched by the intelligence and determination necessary to pursue justice regardless of the obstacles involved. Examine the evidence Kate had risked everything to preserve with the careful attention of someone who understood its significance. asking detailed questions that revealed both legal expertise and genuine moral outrage at the crimes documented. In Samuel's papers, "This is extensive enough to destroy Morrison completely," Blackwood announced after hours of careful review. Financial records, correspondence with corrupt officials, photographic evidence of conditions in his factories, testimony from workers who died under suspicious circumstances. He looked up at Kate with something approaching awe. "Young woman, you've handed me everything necessary to dismantle one of the most corrupt organizations in the territory." The federal marshals who arrested Samuel Morrison 3 days later were the genuine article, armed with warrants that carried the full authority of territorial law. Kate watched from the courthouse steps as they led him away in chains, his carefully constructed image of respectability crumbling under the weight of evidence that no amount of money or influence could suppress. The trial became a sensation that drew attention from newspapers across the country, exposing a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Chicago society. Kate's testimony, delivered with the poise and determination she'd discovered during her flight across Montana, provided the final piece of evidence necessary to ensure Samuel's conviction on charges that would keep him imprisoned for the remainder of his natural life. But it was Jim's presence throughout the legal proceedings that meant the most to Kate. He had stayed by her side through every deposition, every court appearance, every moment when Samuel's remaining allies attempted to intimidate or discredit her. His quiet strength had given her the courage to speak, truth that would otherwise have remained buried beneath wealth and influence. When the judge's gavel fell for the final time and Samuel Morrison was led away to begin his sentence, Kate felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the deep satisfaction that comes from standing up to bullies and winning. Justice had been served, innocent people would be protected from future harm, and she had discovered reserves of courage and determination she'd never known she possessed. The wedding took place 6 months later in the little church at Copper Creek, attended by neighbors who had come to know Kate as someone worthy of the respect they'd always accorded Jim Harper. She wore Anna's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, but carrying the blessing of a woman who had understood the true meaning of partnership and shared purpose. Their life together proved to be built on foundations stronger than passion or convenience, rooted in mutual respect and shared values that had been tested under the most demanding circumstances possible. Kate discovered that she possessed not only the courage to stand against injustice, but the practical skills necessary to help build something lasting and meaningful from raw land and determined effort. The ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding beyond cattle into diverse enterprises that provided employment for families seeking honest work and fair wages. Kate's experience with Samuel's victims had taught her to recognize the signs of exploitation and abuse, and she made it her mission to ensure that everyone who worked for them was treated with dignity and paid what their labor was actually worth. Years later, when their own children played in the yard where Kate had once hidden in terror from Samuel's hunters, she would sometimes pause in her daily work to marvel at the unexpected turns that had brought her to this place of safety and purpose. The woman who had once measured her worth by others' approval had learned to find satisfaction in work that mattered, in relationships built on honesty rather than obligation, in a life that honored both justice and love. Jim would find her during these moments of reflection, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection of someone who had earned the right to such intimacy through years of shared struggle and triumph. Kate felt the world tilt sideways as she recognized the careful choreography of Samuel's revenge beginning to unfold. He had found her more quickly than she had dared fear, his resources proving even more extensive than her worst nightmares had suggested. The federal marshals were undoubtedly fraudulent, but their credentials would be impressive enough to fool local authorities, who had no reason to question official-looking documents. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description," Jim said calmly, his voice betraying none of the protective fury Kate knew he must be feeling. Not many single women pass through this area, and word travels fast when they do. One of the supposed marshals, a lean man with predatory eyes, stepped forward to take control of the conversation. "Mr. Harper, we have reliable information suggesting that Miss Sullivan may have sought shelter at your ranch following an injury sustained during her flight from Chicago." His smile held no warmth, only the calculated menace of someone accustomed to intimidating cooperation from reluctant witnesses. "Her family is naturally concerned about her welfare and eager to ensure her safe return." Kate admired Jim's performance as he maintained his fiction with convincing bewilderment. "If someone like that had showed up here, I'd certainly remember. Like I told the sheriff, this is a quiet area where everyone knows everyone else's business." The marshal's expression hardened at this continued denial, his patience clearly running thin. "Perhaps we could have a look around your property, just to satisfy ourselves that she's not here. Wouldn't want to leave any stone unturned in our search for this missing young lady." Jim's hesitation was perfectly calculated, long enough to suggest reluctance overcome by civic duty. "I suppose that would be all right, though I should warn you that my dog doesn't take kindly to strangers poking around. Rex has strong feelings about protecting what he considers his territory." Kate marveled at Jim's ability to maintain this performance under circumstances that must be costing him enormous effort. Every instinct she was developing about his character told her that he was fighting the urge to settle this matter with violence rather than deception, but his commitment to her safety overrode any desire for dramatic confrontation. The search that followed was thorough but ultimately fruitless, the false marshals examining every building and corner of the ranch with professional competence, while Jim shadowed their movements with helpful commentary about his property's layout and history. Kate had hidden herself in the root cellar again, listening to footsteps above her head, while clutching the loaded pistol Jim had insisted she carry. The minutes stretched like hours as she waited for discovery and capture, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might give away her location. Sheriff Bradley's voice carried clearly through the wooden floor as he questioned Jim about recent visitors, unusual activity, anything that might suggest contact with someone matching Kate's description. The conversation revealed that Samuel had prepared his story carefully, providing details about Kate's supposed mental instability, her history of erratic behavior, the family's desperate concern for her welfare. The fiction was believable enough to explain why she might flee without apparent cause, while justifying extraordinary measures to ensure her return. Her father's offering a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery, the lead marshal mentioned as their search neared completion. $5,000 for anyone who can provide her location or assist in returning her safely to her family. The sum was staggering by frontier standards, enough to tempt even honest people beyond their capacity to resist. Kate felt despair wash over her as she realized how effectively Samuel had stacked the odds against her survival. Every stranger she encountered would see dollar signs rather than a person in need of help. Every potential ally would be forced to weigh their conscience against financial security for their families. The search party finally departed with obvious reluctance, their failure to find evidence of Kate's presence clearly frustrating men accustomed to successful outcomes. Sheriff Bradley lingered longer than the others, his expression troubled as he studied Jim's face for signs of deception. The two men had known each other for years, their relationship built on mutual respect and shared values, but duty required Bradley to pursue every lead regardless of personal feelings. "Jim, if you know something about this woman, you need to understand what you're getting into," Bradley said quietly after the marshals had ridden out of earshot. "These federal boys aren't the kind to give up easy, and the money involved has folks talking in ways that might surprise you." Jim's response carried conviction that convinced even Kate of his sincerity. "Tom, I give you my word that I haven't seen hide nor hair of any woman matching the description those marshals provided. If she had come through here, you'd be the first person I'd notify." Bradley nodded, apparently satisfied by this assurance, but his parting words carried warning that sent chills through Kate's listening ears. "Just remember that harboring a fugitive can carry serious consequences, especially when federal authorities are involved. Whatever friendship we have wouldn't protect you if evidence suggested you were interfering with their investigation." The silence that followed the search party's departure felt heavy with unspoken implications and difficult decisions. Jim helped Kate from her hiding place with gentle hands that couldn't quite disguise their trembling, his relief at avoiding immediate discovery tempered by understanding that their reprieve was temporary at best. Samuel's resources had proven more extensive than either of them had anticipated, his ability to manipulate official channels more sophisticated than they had prepared to counter. "We can't stay here," Kate said, voicing the conclusion they both understood. "Every hour I remain puts you at greater risk, and they'll be back with better stories and more convincing evidence." Jim's response surprised her with its immediate certainty. "Then we leave tonight. I know people in Denver who can help get those documents to someone with the authority to act on them, someone Samuel Morrison's money can't reach." The decision to abandon everything Jim had built at the Broken Arrow Ranch was made with the kind of calm determination that had carried him through Anna's death and the lonely years that followed. Kate tried to protest the sacrifice he was making, the magnitude of what he was giving up to protect someone he had known for only weeks, but he cut off her objections with gentle firmness. "Kate, this ranch was built by two people who believed in standing up for what's right, regardless of personal cost," he said simply. "Anna would never forgive me if I let fear prevent me from doing what I know is necessary." The preparations for their departure took place under cover of darkness, Jim moving through his property with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly what could be abandoned and what was essential for survival. Clothes, weapons, supplies for the journey, and the precious documents that had cost Kate everything were packed onto horses selected for stamina rather than speed. Everything else, the accumulated possessions of 8 years of building a life, together with Anna, remained behind like offerings to an uncertain future. Kate watched Jim lock the door of his home for what might be the last time, understanding that this moment marked the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of something entirely unknown. The grief etched into his features as he turned away from the house spoke of losses that went far beyond material possessions, sacrifices that honored both his dead wife's memory and his living commitment to justice. The journey to Denver tested every skill they possessed and reserves of determination neither had known they carried. 3 days of hard riding through country that offered concealment at the cost of brutal physical demands, always listening for sounds of pursuit that might announce the end of their flight. Kate's body ached from hours in the saddle, her hands cramped from gripping reins, but she pushed through discomfort with the knowledge that giving up meant worse than death. Judge Harrison Blackwood proved to be everything Kate had hoped when she conceived her desperate plan to expose Samuel's crimes. A man whose reputation for incorruptible integrity was matched by the intelligence and determination necessary to pursue justice regardless of obstacles. He examined the evidence she had preserved with the careful attention of someone who understood its significance completely. "This documentation is extensive enough to destroy Morrison's entire operation," Blackwood announced after hours of careful review. "Financial records proving corruption, correspondence detailing witness intimidation, photographic evidence of criminal negligence." He looked up at Kate with something approaching reverence. "Miss Sullivan, you've provided everything necessary to dismantle one of the most corrupt organizations in the territory." The arrest warrant for Samuel Morrison was signed that same day. Federal marshals dispatched to Chicago with instructions that allowed no possibility of escape or interference. Kate watched from the courthouse steps as news of the action spread through Denver, understanding that she had finally achieved something worthy of the sacrifices required to make it possible. The trial that followed became a sensation that drew attention from newspapers across the country, exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of society. Kate's testimony, delivered with poise and determination she had discovered during her flight across Montana, provided the final evidence necessary to ensure Samuel's conviction on charges that would keep him imprisoned for life. But it was Jim's presence throughout the legal proceedings that sustained Kate through moments when her courage wavered. He had remained at her side through every deposition, every court appearance, every attempt by Samuel's remaining allies to intimidate or discredit her. His quiet strength had given her the power to speak truths that might otherwise have remained buried beneath wealth and influence. When the judge's gavel fell for the final time and Samuel Morrison was led away to begin his sentence, Kate felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood: the profound satisfaction that comes from standing up to bullies and winning. Justice had been served. Innocent people would be protected from future harm, and she had discovered reserves of courage she had never known she possessed. The proposal came 6 months later on the porch of the small house they had rented in Denver while waiting for the legal proceedings to conclude. Jim had been unusually quiet during dinner, his conversation limited to practical matters and weather observations that didn't require his full attention. Kate had sensed something building in his manner for days, a nervous energy that reminded her of how he had behaved before making difficult decisions about the ranch. "Kate," he said finally, his voice carrying the same careful determination that had marked his decision to shelter her despite the risks involved. "I know this isn't the way these things are supposed to happen. No courtship, no proper introductions, no time to discover whether we're truly compatible." He reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand in his own, calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "But I've learned something about myself these past months," he continued, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I learned that Anna was right when she said that love isn't something you fall into by accident. It's something you choose, something you build through shared values and mutual respect and the willingness to stand together against whatever challenges the world might offer." Kate felt tears threatening as she recognized the direction his words were taking, hardly daring to hope that this man who had already given her so much might be offering something even more precious. "I'm choosing you, Kate Sullivan," Jim said simply. "Not because you need protection or because I'm lonely, but because you've shown me the kind of person you are when everything you care about is at stake. I've seen your courage, your integrity, your willingness to sacrifice everything for people you don't even know." His grip on her hand tightened slightly, emphasizing the importance of what he was saying. "I'd be honored if you'd consider building a life with me." Kate's answer came without hesitation, rising from depths of certainty she hadn't known existed within her. "Yes," she said, the word carrying all the conviction and gratitude and love she felt for this extraordinary man who had taught her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. "Yes, Jim Harper, I choose you too." The wedding took place 3 months later in the little church at Copper Creek, attended by neighbors who had come to know Kate as someone worthy of the respect they had always accorded. Jim, she wore Anna's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, but carrying the blessing of a woman who had understood the true meaning of partnership and shared purpose. The ceremony was simple but profound, their vows spoken with the gravity of people who understood exactly what they were promising each other. Their return to the Broken Arrow Ranch revealed a property that had been carefully maintained by neighbors who understood the value of preserving something good for the people who had built it. Frank and Ruby Patterson had overseen the cattle. Dr. Whitman had tended the house and garden, and Sheriff Bradley had ensured that no one took advantage of their absence to claim what wasn't rightfully theirs. The life Kate and Jim built together proved to be rooted in foundations stronger than passion or convenience, growing from mutual respect and shared values that had been tested under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Kate discovered that she possessed not only the courage to stand against injustice, but the practical skills necessary to help expand their operation into something that could provide employment and fair wages for families seeking honest work. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing beyond simple cattle ranching to include diverse enterprises that served the needs of their expanding community. Kate's experience with Samuel's victims had taught her to recognize signs of exploitation and abuse, making her determined that everyone who worked for them would be treated with dignity and compensated fairly for their contributions. Years later, when their own children played in the yard where Kate had once hidden in terror from Samuel's hunters, she would sometimes pause in her daily work to marvel at the unexpected turns that had brought her to this place of safety and purpose. The woman who had once measured her worth by others' approval had learned to find satisfaction in work that mattered, in relationships built on honesty rather than obligation, in a life that honored both justice and love. Jim would find her during these moments of reflection, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection of someone who had earned the right to such intimacy through years of shared struggle and triumph. Together they would watch their children chase chickens and climb hay bales, secure in the knowledge that they had built something worthy of protection, and proud of the price they had been willing to pay for the privilege. The prairie wind that sang through the grass around their home carried no trace of the loneliness that had once marked Jim Harper's existence, or the fear that had driven Kate Sullivan's desperate flight from Chicago. Instead, it whispered of second chances seized and courage rewarded, of love that grew not from fairy tale romance, but from the deeper bond that forms between people who choose to stand together against whatever challenges the world might offer. Sometimes the people we're waiting for never come, but sometimes the ones who arrive instead teach us that we were waiting for the wrong things entirely. Kate Sullivan had boarded a train seeking escape and found instead a home worth fighting for, a man worth loving, and the strength to become someone worth being. The wounded bride who had collapsed at a remote train station had discovered that healing sometimes requires not just bandages and rest, but the courage to trust again and the wisdom to recognize when you've finally found the place where you belong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.